The ditch was 6 feet deep, and Roy Calhoun was at the bottom of it, and it was 28 degrees outside and had been for 3 hours. And if you want to understand what that does to a man in a leather jacket who cannot move, understand that Roy had stopped shaking 20 minutes ago, which meant the shaking was no longer the problem. He had heard the gravel on the road's shoulder, small footsteps, then a face appeared at the edge of the ditch. A boy, young, maybe 8 or 9, with a backpack over his shoulder and a gray jacket on, looking down at Roy with an expression that was not frightened and was not confused. It was the expression of someone who had assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion about what needed to happen next. The boy said, "Are you hurt bad?" Roy tried to answer. The words were not cooperating. The boy looked at him for a moment. He set his backpack down on the road behind him. He unzipped his jacket, a gray Carhartt, kid's cut, the sleeve stopping 2 inches above his wrists, and he took it off. The January air hit him immediately. He did not hesitate. He climbed down into the ditch, and he spread the jacket over Roy's chest, and he tucked it around Roy's shoulders with the careful attention of a child who has put blankets on people before and knows how the tucking matters. Then he looked at Roy's face. "I'm going to get help," he said. "I'll be right back." He climbed out of the ditch. He went to the road. He had been 9 years old and wearing a gray jacket that was too small for him and walking to school alone in January on a county road in Georgia. And he had given the coat off his back to a stranger in a ditch without anyone telling him to. And it had taken him approximately 45 seconds from seeing Roy to making the decision to act. This is the story of what 500 people did when they heard about those 45 seconds. Roy Calhoun was 51 years old and had been riding in the Georgia chapter for 19 years and had come off a bike before, once on gravel in his 20s, once on sand at a rally, once in the rain on a bridge, and each time had learned something specific about how motorcycles and pavement interact under unexpected conditions. What he had not previously encountered was black ice at 5:30 in the morning on a county road in Dalton County, which announced itself not with any warning, but simply as the sudden and complete removal of the rear wheel's relationship with the ground. The bike went down. Roy went with it into the ditch on the right shoulder. He had bruised ribs. He would learn this at the hospital, and a small fracture in his left wrist that had been caused by catching himself on the ditch's edge. The fractures and the bruises were not the problem in the immediate term. The problem was that his phone had struck the ditch wall, and the screen had destroyed itself in a way that made calls impossible. And that the black ice meant no other cars had come down this road in the hour after the fall, and that the temperature was 28 degrees and dropping. He had a leather jacket. It was a good jacket, thick, broken in, built for riding in cold weather. It was not built for lying still in a ditch in January for several hours. He had felt the cold arrive in stages, first as discomfort and then as something more serious. And by the time the shaking stopped, he had been in the ditch for more than 2 hours, and he had begun to understand the specific arithmetic of the situation. He had a son named Dylan. Dylan was 9 years old and lived with his mother in Macon and visited Roy in the summers. 6 weeks that Roy had been telling himself for 3 years were sufficient and had known for 2 years were not. Dylan had his mother's eyes and Roy's hands and a habit of asking questions about things that most 9-year-olds didn't ask questions about, like why bridges were built the way they were and what made certain stars brighter than others. Roy had been answering these questions in the summers and thinking about them during the rest of the year, and meaning every September, to make the drive to Macon more than twice before the following June. He was thinking about Dylan when he heard the small footsteps on the gravel. Before we find out who that boy was and what happened next, hit subscribe and drop your city and state in the comments right now. People are watching this from everywhere tonight, and I want to know where you are. I read every single one. Now, back to Dalton County, Georgia. Because the boy who came over the edge of that ditch had been walking a road that most people never thought about, and it was time someone thought about it. His name was Mason Cole, and he was 9 years old, and he had been walking the 4 miles from his house on Old Mill Road to Dalton County Elementary School every weekday morning since September. Not because he wanted to, because the school bus route had a fee that Mason's mother had looked at in August and set aside in the way she set aside things that weren't possible right now, which was with a specific expression that Mason had learned to read without asking about it. His mother worked 2 jobs, the early shift at the diner in town and 2 evenings a week at the grocery distribution center on Route 9. She was gone before Mason left for school and home after he was in bed on distribution center nights. And on the other nights, she made dinner and asked about his day and fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock. Mason had been getting himself ready for school since September. He had not told anyone about the walk, which was not a secret exactly. His teacher knew and had offered to speak with his mother about transportation assistance, and Mason had asked her not to because his mother had enough to worry about. He had a coat, a gray Carhartt kids jacket that his aunt had given him for Christmas 2 winters ago when he was 7 and the sleeves fell past his hands. He was 9 now and the sleeves ended 2 inches above his wrists and the jacket closed across the chest, only if he held his elbows in slightly. But it was warm, and it was his, and it was the coat he had. He walked to school every morning regardless of the weather. He had developed, over the months of walking, the specific relationship with a road that forms when you travel it repeatedly and slowly, learning where the gravel was loose, where the ditch ran close to the shoulder, where a particular oak's roots had cracked the asphalt. He had learned where the hawk sat on the power line on Tuesday mornings. He had learned the frost patterns that formed on the low puddles in the hollow between the 2nd and 3rd mile. He had learned to read what was on the road and what had changed since the day before and what was ordinary and what was not. What was not ordinary on this January morning was a man lying at the bottom of the right side ditch at the 2.5-mile mark. Mason stopped. He looked at the man. He looked at the motorcycle on its side in the ditch further along. He looked at the man's face. He had the expression that Roy had described later to the chapter more than once, like he was figuring something out. Not scared, not confused, working something out. Mason had put his father to bed on 3 occasions when his father came home in a condition that required it, before his father left. He knew how to assess a person's state by looking at their face. He climbed down. He gave Roy the coat. He tucked it. He said he was getting help. He climbed out. He went to the road and he stood in the January cold in his shirt, a gray thermal, thin enough that the cold reached him immediately through the fabric, and he waited for a car. He waited 11 minutes. The car that came was a white pickup driven by a woman named Linda Marsh, who was on her way to open her farm supply store and who slowed when she saw a child standing alone on the road's shoulder at 6:20. In the morning, in 30-degree weather, with no coat on, Linda Marsh had been a mother for 31 years and a grandmother for 6, and she read the situation correctly before she had fully stopped the truck. Mason told her what was in the ditch. Linda called 911. She gave Mason the emergency blanket from her truck's kit and insisted he put it around his shoulders, and he did, because she was the kind of woman whose insisting required compliance, and they waited together by the side of the road for the paramedics. The paramedics arrived in 14 minutes. They went down into the ditch. Roy was brought out on a board, precautionary, and loaded into the ambulance. Mason stood by the road with the emergency blanket around his shoulders and watched the ambulance lights move away down the county road. He stood there until the lights were gone. He picked up his backpack. He walked the remaining 1.5 miles to school. He was 40 minutes late. His teacher, Mrs. Gould, looked at the emergency blanket and at the lack of a coat and at Mason's face, and she sat him down and got him a cup of hot chocolate from the teacher's lounge and asked him what had happened. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was the correct response, and when he was done, she sat for a moment and then she sent him to the nurse's office with instructions to stay warm. She made 2 phone calls. At Dalton County Regional Medical Center, Roy was treated for hypothermia and the fractured wrist and the bruised ribs and released the following morning. His chapter members had arrived by noon, 6 of them at first, then more through the afternoon, the way chapters arrive when one of their own is in the hospital, which is in waves, as word moves, and people find the time to come. Roy told them about the boy 3 times before anyone asked him to stop. He told it the way he told the things that had gotten into him and stayed there, with the specific words, in the specific order, not adding or removing anything. The face at the edge of the ditch, the gray Carhartt with the 2 short sleeves, the 45 seconds, the coat tucked around his shoulders. I'm going to get help. I'll be right back. Earl Banks was sitting in the corner of the hospital room when Roy told it the 3rd time. Earl was 58 years old and had been Georgia chapter president for 9 years and was not demonstrative by nature. He sat in the corner and listened to the story, and when Roy finished, he said, "You know his name?" The nurse said someone called from his school, Roy said. Mason Cole. Roy looked at him. I want to give the coat back, he said, and get him a proper one. Earl looked at the ceiling for a moment. We can do better than that, he said. He asked Roy to find a piece of paper. Roy wrote the note in the hospital bed with his right hand, the wrist that hadn't fractured, while Earl sat beside him. It said, Mason, my name is Roy. You pulled me out of that ditch as sure as if you lifted me. I have been looking for a way to say thank you. I hope we meet soon. Roy? He folded it once and gave it to Earl. Earl made the calls that afternoon and the next morning, through the night, in the way that chapter presidents make polls when the thing they are organizing is something the chapter has decided matters. The call to the sporting goods store in Gainesville, whose manager was a chapter associate and who had a proper insulated kid's jacket in a size that Earl confirmed with Mason's school. A blue one, serious, the kind that handled a Georgia January the way a Georgia January deserved to be handled. The call to the road captain about the 4-mile route from Mason's house to the school. The call to the neighboring chapters about the number in the morning. He called Mason's mother, Diane, on Thursday evening. He introduced himself. He said he understood her son had helped one of his brothers. He asked if he could bring some people by in the morning before school. He said how many people, approximately. Diane was quiet for a long moment. She said he's never told me about the walk. Earl said he wouldn't. She said, Dawn. She said, he leaves at 7:15. Engines. They came down Route 9 and the county roads feeding into Old Mill Road in the hour before dawn. 500 motorcycles moving through the Georgia January dark with their headlights on. Finding the road and the positions that Earl's road captain had laid out. They parked on both shoulders of Old Mill Road, the road Mason walked every morning, starting from the end of Mason's driveway and running 4 miles to the school's entrance. They cut their engines. They stood beside their bikes in the cold and waited. The sky began to separate from the tree line at 6:50. At 7 o'clock, the road was still, and the riders were still, and the January cold moved through everything without any particular urgency. And the only sounds were the sounds that winter Georgia mornings make. The distant complaint of crows, the creak of frozen branches. Earl Banks stood at the end of Mason's driveway. At 7:14, the porch light at the house came on. The door opened at 7:15. Mason Cole came out of his house in the new blue coat. Diane had given it to him before he was awake, saying only that something had come and that he should put it on. And he stepped off the porch and looked at the road. He stopped. He looked to the left, which was the direction of town and school, and the road was lined on both sides as far as he could see, which was the entire 4 miles, people standing beside motorcycles in the early January light, the breath of 500 people making small clouds in the cold. He looked to the right. The road was lined there too, back past the house. He stood on the bottom step of the porch. Earl walked from the end of the driveway to where Mason was standing and crouched to his level, which was a thing that men with some practice at it did without thinking. You know, Roy, Earl said. The man in the ditch, Mason said. He wanted you to have something. He gave Mason the note. Mason read it. He read it carefully the way he looked at things, completely without hurrying. He looked at the road. All those people are for me, he said. All those people, Earl said, are for the boy who gave his coat. He looked the way he looked on his walks, at the specific things, the details, the hawk on the wire and the frost in the mailbox. He looked at 500 people standing on the road he had been walking alone since September. He said, okay. He picked up his backpack. He started walking. He walked the full 4 miles. He walked the way he always walked, steady, looking at things, not slow, and not hurrying. The people on the road did not speak to him. They stood beside their bikes and they watched him walk, and some of them nodded, and some of them did not. And the road was quiet, except for Mason's footsteps on the asphalt and the particular silence of 500 people paying attention. At the 2.5-mile mark, Mason slowed. He looked to the right shoulder, where the ditch ran close, and he looked at the place. He stood there for a moment. Nobody spoke. He kept walking. At the school entrance, Roy was there. He was standing beside a chapter member's car, left arm in a sling, gray-bearded, large, which was the same large that he had been in the ditch, except that now he was standing and not horizontal, and the comparison made Mason stop and look at him the way you look at a thing that you have known in one state and are seeing in another. Roy looked at the boy. He had been thinking about this moment since the hospital. He had imagined it various ways. What he had not imagined was that it would be this simple. A 9-year-old in a blue coat, looking at him with calm, direct eyes, and Roy not having to say anything complicated. He held out the gray jacket. "I brought it back," he said. Mason looked at the jacket. He looked at Roy. "You can keep it," he said. "I know I can," Roy said. "I want you to have it. Both of them." He nodded toward the blue one. "One for the cold, one to give away, someday when you find someone who needs it more than you do. That's how these things work." Mason looked at both coats, the one he was wearing and the one in Roy's hand. He took the gray one and folded it carefully and put it in his backpack. "Thank you," he said. Roy looked at him. "No," he said. "Thank you." The school bus let off its passengers in the drop zone behind them, and children came through the entrance and the morning started its morning things, and Mason went inside. Roy stood by the car with his arm in its sling. The road behind the school was still lined for 4 miles. Diane Cole drove the route that afternoon, after her morning shift, before the evening one. She drove slowly down Old Mill Road from the school, back to the house, 4 miles, and she looked at the road her son had been walking alone since September, and she thought about the frost patterns in the hollow and the hawk on the wire, and the man in the ditch at the 2.5 mile mark, and she thought about Mason putting on his backpack every morning while she was already gone and walking to school in the gray Carhartt with the sleeves too short. She pulled into the driveway, and she sat in the car for a while. When she went inside, Mason was at the kitchen table doing homework. The blue coat was on the hook by the door. The gray one was folded on the chair beside him. She made dinner. She sat down across from him. She said, "You should have told me about the walk." He looked at her. He said, "You had enough to worry about." "That was mine to decide," she said. He thought about this. He nodded. She said, "It was different today." "How so?" He thought about how to describe it. "There were people," he said, "the whole way." She put her hand over his on the table. He looked down at her hand, and then he looked up, and he didn't say anything else. Because he was 9, and he had been managing things alone for a while, and some of the managing had been very hard, and the hard part had not stopped being hard simply because someone put their hand over his, but the hand was there. Roy drove to Macon in March, not in June. He called Dylan's mother in February and said he was thinking about coming earlier this year, and she said all right and gave him a Saturday in March, and he drove down on Friday evening and stayed at the motel on Route 19, and in the morning he went to Dylan's baseball practice and watched from the aluminum bleachers. Dylan played second base. He had his mother's eyes and Roy's hands, and he caught a throw in the gap between second and first. That was the kind of catch that makes the parents on the bleachers go quiet. Afterward, Dylan came over to the bleachers. He stood in front of Roy and looked at the sling that was still on Roy's arm and said, "What happened?" He said, "Is it a long story?" Roy said, "It's a story about a 9-year-old who did something I want you to hear about." Dylan looked at him for a moment with those eyes. "Okay," he said. They walked to the car. There are children in this world who give what they have without calculating what it costs, and what it costs is never small, and the giving is never about the amount. A gray jacket 2 sizes too small is not nothing when it is everything you have on a January road in Georgia. That boy on that road gave a man his warmth, and 500 people who heard about it understood, in the way that certain things are understood immediately and completely, that the road between Mason's house and his school should never feel empty again. They made sure of it. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who needs to remember that the biggest acts sometimes come from the smallest people. Hit subscribe and type Mason in the comments. I'll read every one.